It's Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are all called according to his purpose. I think I'm going to start out by sharing that when I was a little girl, I suffered from severe anxiety, and nobody in my family really understood that or knew that. I started getting debilitating panic attacks at ages 9, 10, and 11. And the physical symptoms, the worst physical symptoms were when my chest would seize up. It would feel like my heart was hurting. It would feel like my lungs couldn't breathe. And sometimes I couldn't catch my breath. And when I would try to catch my breath, I would be in a great deal of pain. And so the anxiety and panic was then accompanied by me fearing that I was going to die, because I was smart enough to understand that if you can't breathe, you can't live. That just made the panic attacks worse. And eventually, my parents took me to a doctor. I had EKGs, I had x-rays, I had blood work, I had a full exam. And the doctor said to my parents, "There's nothing physically wrong with Leslie. She's well. We think this might be anxiety and not something physically wrong with her." Well, my parents were very relieved to hear that, and so was I. Thank God, nothing is physically wrong. That's great news. Now, I would talk to any adult who would listen about my anxiety and stress and nervousness. Having an anxiety disorder and starting to learn about my own sinful nature, which I never really concerned myself with before, started eating away at my nerves. I began to ruminate and have anxiety about my sinful nature. I decided I was selfish. I was a liar. I'm not going to admit all my sins on your show, but by the time you're in your early 20s, you've made a lot of mistakes and you've hurt a lot of people. There are consequences for sin. And I just started feeling really bad about myself, and it put me into a bit of a depression, and I felt some anxiety. So one day I said, you know what, I've got to return to meditation. I'm feeling too anxious and too depressed. I'm ruminating constantly about sin. So I lay down on my bed and I started that very simple body scan centering technique that my 6th grade teacher taught me. I did get to a point where I was able to really calm my body and my mind and feel very relaxed. But there was something in the back of my mind saying, this just isn't enough. You need to pray. And I thought, well, what would it be like to combine prayer with meditation? So I started to pray, and I asked God to forgive me. Now, there wasn't a whole lot of reference to Jesus at that time, because I wasn't really a fully practicing Christian at that time, but I was praying to God, to the Holy Spirit, what have you, and asking him to forgive me, admitting that I was a sinful person, telling him I was really having a hard time with depression and anxiety, and asking for his blessing and his grace. And I'm in this extremely relaxed, meditative state while praying. And then my body started to vibrate. I just accepted that experience. It felt very comforting. It felt kind of like getting a massage. I don't really know how to explain that, but my entire body tingled and vibrated, and the vibrating became more and more intense. It was not uncomfortable, but it was a new sensation. Also heard, I don't know how to explain the noise I heard, but it was kind of a buzzing, vibrating noise. It did not hurt my ears. but I could hear the vibration. And the vibration became more and more intense until I vibrated right out of my body. And the sensation was that the vibration out of my body led through my chest and led kind of up. At the same time, I felt like something was coming into my body as well, that a vibration entered my body. But I definitely felt myself vibrate out of my body, and I went into a tunnel. The tunnel was not pitch black. It was illuminated, and I was comfortable, and I was suspended. And there was somebody to my right who was protecting me and guiding me. This I just intuitively knew. I didn't get to see him. I didn't think to turn to look at him, because at the top of the tunnel was a light that was catching my attention. And I kept moving up that tunnel to where the light was. And finally, I stopped, probably halfway, 3/4 of the way through the tunnel. I stopped. Somebody stopped me. And I was suspended, very comfortably suspended. No anxiety, no stress, peace. I felt very much at peace. And then the light started spilling into the tunnel. And the light came toward me, and I started feeling unconditional love. I was overwhelmed by the love of the light, and the light also had incredibly intense compassion and mercy and everything good. And this unconditional love and compassion was so intense but didn't hurt. It radiated through me. It enveloped me. It held me. And it was very strong. It was almost like I can't take any more of this, but I could. It was intense but gentle, and I knew it was God. I just knew that kind of love and compassion comes from God. And it was a healing. It was a healing for the guilt I was experiencing and the anxiety and the depression I had over my human sinful nature. It was a healing. And it was beautiful. And I don't know how long it went on, but at some point it calmed down a bit, and it spoke to me. The light spoke to me. God spoke to me. And he said two things. He said, remember the center of things, and remember what controls things. Well, I understood. Now, mind you, he didn't have to say he loved me because I was feeling it. But I understood that light was the center of things. That light was the center of the universe. I understood that. But I didn't really understand what controls things. I thought I control things. And I didn't really understand that, but I heard it. And at that point, I kind of started looking around this tunnel, and I recognized where I was. And then I realized I'm in that tunnel, and there's that light, and I must be dead. And that disturbed me for a minute. I was kind of upset about that for a minute, maybe a millisecond. As soon as that thought came to mind, I was put right back in my body, just sucked back down that tunnel and hit my body pretty hard, and realized, wow, I was out of my body and I got a healing, and I saw God and he gave me a message. And I was only about 20. I'm 59 now, so I mean, that tells you how long ago it was, and I remember it like it was yesterday. So the fortunate thing for me is I got out of my bed and I went to the phone. Years ago, the phone was on the wall. And I called my boyfriend, who was Catholic, and I told him what happened to me, and he believed me. he went ahead and listened to that, and he was supportive. But it ended up, he wasn't something he wanted to talk about all the time. I wanted to talk about it all the time. I wanted to think about the meaning of that all the time. And of course, that was too much for him. So I went to see a priest. I had a chapel in my dorm. There was a priest who had an office in my dorm. I went to see him, and I told him about my experience. And the first thing he asked me was, were you on drugs? I didn't do drugs. I didn't do drugs in college or ever, really. Were you drinking? Well, from time to time I did have alcohol, but not that day. No. Do you have a mental problem? Well, I was going through some depression and anxiety, but not enough really to provoke a psychotic break. And he really didn't have anything to offer me. And I was very disappointed about that. But because I read Raymond Moody's book, I also knew that it's very common for clergy to be unprepared to deal with a person who has an out-of-body experience like that. So I forgave him. When I came out of that, the gift from that was an undeniable belief in God. I knew God existed. And I also knew if my consciousness can exist outside of my body, then I don't fear death anymore. There is such a thing as life after death. So I'm only 20 years old, and I came away from that experience with those gifts. There is a God, and I don't fear death. So that was my first out-of-body experience.